I always thought I'd live the rest of my life without knowing why my family cut me off. But then, out of nowhere, I got an email that felt like a ticking time bomb. The subject line simply said, "The truth." It was from my brother, Dan. I hadn't heard from him, or anyone in my family, in nearly 8 years. Not since they ghosted me after his divorce. So seeing his name in my inbox made my stomach drop. But the email itself? That was worse. "You deserve to know what really happened," it started. "I've been holding this in for years, but I can't anymore. You didn't deserve what they did to you, and if you're willing to meet, I'll tell you everything. I just hope you're ready for it." No explanation, no apology, just cryptic promises of some earth-shattering truth. My first thought was, what could possibly be so big that it took almost a decade for you to reach out? My second thought? This has to be a trap. I didn't respond at first. I mean, how do you even process something like that? My family cut me off after Dan's ugly divorce because I refused to choose sides. I thought that was the whole reason. But now he's telling me there's more? After pacing my apartment for hours and overthinking every possible scenario, I finally replied, "Tell me what you mean. I'm not agreeing to meet until I know what this is about." His response came just an hour later, short but loaded. "I'll explain everything in person. Please, just meet me. You don't understand how deep this goes." That was it. No details, no reassurances, just a vague warning that sounded like it belonged in a bad spy movie. And maybe that's what hooked me. I'd spent years telling myself I didn't care what they thought, but suddenly, here was Dan, dangling answers like bait on a hook. 2 days later, I was sitting in a dingy booth at a 24-hour diner, waiting for the brother I hadn't seen in nearly a decade. He showed up 15 minutes late, looking rough, like he hadn't slept in days. "You came," he said, sliding into the seat across from me. "Cut the small talk." I shot back. "What's this all about?" He didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned in, lowering his voice like we were being watched. "Before I tell you anything, you need to promise me you won't freak out. Dan, you drag me here for answers. Just spit it out already." He took a deep breath, fidgeting with the coffee mug the waitress had just dropped off. "Mom and Dad had a lot riding on me staying married to Lisa," he started. "What the hell are you talking about?" "They were involved in something illegal. Really illegal. And Lisa was their accountant." That stopped me cold. "Our parents? The same people who refused to let me get a tattoo because it was irresponsible? They were involved in something illegal?" I stared at him, trying to process what he just said. "Illegal how?" "Money laundering," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And when Lisa threatened to go to the police during the divorce, they panicked. They made me choose, her or them." "And you chose them," I said flatly, the anger already bubbling up. "I didn't have a choice," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to draw a glance from the table behind us. "You don't understand. They had dirt on me too, enough to ruin my life. They blackmailed me, okay? And when you refused to side with them, they decided you were a liability." A liability. That's what I'd been reduced to in their eyes. What did they think I was going to do? I demanded. Go to the cops? I didn't even know anything. "They weren't taking chances," he said. "They thought keeping you out of the loop was safer, for everyone." I wanted to scream. 8 years. 8 years of loneliness, confusion, and anger. All because my parents were running some shady operation and thought I was the risk? Dan must have seen the fury on my face because he raised his hands, like he was trying to calm me down. "I know how it sounds, but there's more to it. Stuff you need to know. Stuff that might put you in danger if you're not careful." I leaned back, my stomach churning. "Why are you telling me this now?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Because they're still doing it, and I think they're about to get caught." I didn't know what to say. My parents had been involved in money laundering for years, and they'd managed to ruin my life in the process, all without a word of explanation. Now, Dan was sitting across from me, telling me they were about to get caught. "Why do you think they're going to be exposed?" I finally asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Dan glanced over his shoulder, like he was afraid someone might overhear us. "It's not just a hunch," he said. "Lisa, she's the one turning them in. My jaw clenched. Lisa? The same Lisa they destroyed you over? She didn't have a choice, Dan said. She's been building a case for years. She reached out to me last month, first time we've talked since the divorce. She said the feds are on to them, and they're looking for cooperating witnesses. She wanted to know if I'd testify. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And what did you say? I told her no, Dan admitted, looking ashamed. I'm already too deep in this. If I talk, I go down with them. But Lisa's different. She has all the records, the receipts, the paper trails. If she talks, it's over for Mom and Dad. Good, I said before I could stop myself. Dan winced, but he didn't argue. Look, I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But if this goes public, it won't just be them who go down. If their clients find out who blew the whistle. Clients? I interrupted. What clients? Dan hesitated, like he wasn't sure how much to tell me. They weren't just laundering money for fun. They were working with some dangerous people, people who don't take betrayal lightly. Like who? I pressed. I don't know exactly, he said, but the way his eyes darted away told me he was lying. Don't give me that, I snapped. If you're going to drag me into this, you owe me the truth. Dan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Fine. I've heard names. Cartels, organized crime groups, people who don't ask questions as long as the money moves smoothly. That's why Lisa reaching out was such a big deal. If she flips, it's not just Mom and Dad who are in danger. It's everyone they've been working with and anyone connected to them. Like you, I said, my voice cold. He nodded grimly. And maybe you too. Me? I almost laughed. I haven't talked to them in years. How could I possibly be involved in this? Because you're still their kid, he said. If someone decides to go after them, they might come after us too. It doesn't matter that you've been out of the picture. These people don't care about fairness. I sat back, my mind racing. So what are you saying? That I should just hide and hope no one notices I exist? Not exactly, Dan said. That's why I wanted to meet. Lisa gave me something, evidence, I guess you could call it. She said if anything happened to her, I should give it to the authorities. Why are you telling me this? Because I think you should have it, he said. I stared at him, stunned. You want me to hold on to evidence that could put our parents in prison? Evidence that could make me a target for the people they've been working with? It's safer with you, he said. They know where I am. They're watching me. But you? You're off their radar. If you keep it hidden? Absolutely not, I interrupted. I'm not getting involved in this. I've spent years trying to rebuild my life after what they did to me. I'm not risking everything because you're scared to do the right thing. Dan looked like he wanted to argue, but before he could say anything, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, and his face went pale. What is it? I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he picked up the phone and answered the call. Hello? His voice was tense. I couldn't hear what the person on the other end was saying, but whatever it was, it made Dan's hand tighten around the phone. Are you sure? He asked. When? A long pause. Then, yeah. Okay. Thanks. He hung up and looked at me, his face a mixture of fear and urgency. We have to go. Now. Go where? I asked, alarmed. Somewhere safe, he said, already standing up. That was Lisa. She says they know she's been talking to the feds. She thinks they're coming after her, and anyone connected to her. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. You're not serious. I wish I wasn't, Dan said. But if they're on to Lisa, it's only a matter of time before they figure out she's been talking to me. And if they know I've met with you. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Let's go, he said again, his voice urgent. Against my better judgment, I followed him out of the diner. My heart was pounding as we got into his car and sped off, no destination in mind. For the first time in years, I wasn't just angry or confused. I was terrified. Because whatever my family had gotten themselves into, I was now part of it. We drove in silence for a long time. Dan kept checking his mirrors like he thought someone might be following us. His jaw tight and his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. I didn't say anything at first because I was still trying to process what had just happened. The idea that my parents were involved in organized crime was horrifying enough, But now I was being dragged into it because of something Lisa did. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Where exactly are we going? Just away for now, Dan said. We'll figure out the next step once we're somewhere safe. That's not good enough, I said, my voice rising. You dragged me into this without even asking, and now you're telling me I just have to trust you? You need to start giving me real answers. Dan sighed but didn't take his eyes off the road. I told you everything I know. Lisa called me because she's scared. She thinks they're going to come after her, and she didn't want me to be blindsided. If they find out we've been talking, they might come after you too. That's why we need to stay ahead of this. I folded my arms, my frustration boiling over. You're asking me to upend my entire life because of a phone call. Do you even know if Lisa's telling the truth? Or are you just panicking because she freaked you out? She wouldn't lie about this, Dan said firmly. She knows what they're capable of. And what exactly are they capable of? I demanded. Dan hesitated, and for a moment, I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, there was a guy. His name was Steve. He used to work with Mom and Dad, handled the logistics side of things. A few years ago, he got into some kind of argument with them over money. A week later, he disappeared. Nobody's seen or heard from him since. I felt a chill run down my spine. You think they did something to him? I don't know, Dan admitted. But the timing wasn't a coincidence. And if they're willing to get rid of someone they worked with, do you think they'd hesitate to go after Lisa? Or us? I didn't have an answer for that, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted one. Dan's phone buzzed again, and he glanced at the screen before tossing it onto the dashboard. It's Lisa, he said. She's probably freaking out. Shouldn't you answer? Not while I'm driving, he said. She'll have to wait. We drove for another half hour before Dan finally pulled into the parking lot of a cheap motel. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s, with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign that read vacancy. Dan parked the car and turned to me. Stay here. I'll get us a room. I wanted to argue, but I was too exhausted to fight anymore. I watched him walk into the motel office, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do now? I couldn't just disappear from my own life. I had a job, a landlord who expected rent, friends who would wonder why I wasn't answering my phone. Dan came back a few minutes later with a key. He didn't say anything as he unlocked the door to a room on the first floor and motioned for me to follow him inside. The room was as depressing as I'd expected. Thin, scratchy blankets on the bed, a tiny TV bolted to the wall, and a musty smell that made me wrinkle my nose. Dan locked the door behind us and pulled the curtains shut. This is temporary, he said. Just until we figure out the next step. Which is what, exactly? I asked, sitting down on the edge of the bed. We need to talk to Lisa, Dan said. Find out exactly what she told the feds and what she thinks they know about us. And then what? Then we figure out how to protect ourselves, he said. Protect ourselves from what? Mom and Dad? Or the people they've been working with? Both, Dan said, his voice grim. I stared at him, trying to wrap my head around everything. Do you even realize how insane this all sounds? Our parents are criminals. You're telling me they've been laundering money for God knows who, and now we're somehow caught in the middle of it because Lisa decided to go to the cops. How does this even happen? How does a normal family turn into this? They were never normal, Dan said quietly. What are you talking about? Dan leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. You always thought they were perfect. The big house, the family vacations, the way they were so involved in everything we did. But it was all a front. They've been doing this for as long as I can remember. I frowned. What do you mean, as long as you can remember? Dan looked away, his jaw tightening. I was 13 when I found out. I overheard them arguing in Dad's office one night. Something about a client who wanted to pull out. They didn't see me, but I heard enough to know it wasn't anything legal. After that, I started paying attention. I saw things, bags of cash, phone calls they didn't want us to hear, people showing up at the house late at night. They never told me what they were doing, but it wasn't hard to figure out. And you never said anything? What was I supposed to say? Dan shot back. I was a kid. They were my parents. I didn't want to believe it, so I just pretended it wasn't happening. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. All those years, I'd thought Dan was the favorite, the one who could do no wrong. But now I was starting to see that he'd been carrying this secret for most of his life. Why didn't you warn me? I asked. I didn't want you to get caught up in it, Dan said. And honestly, I hope they keep you out of it. You were the youngest. You didn't need to know. Well, now I know, I said bitterly. And look where it's gotten me. Dan didn't respond. The room was silent for a long time, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Finally, Dan's phone buzzed again, and he sighed. I need to call Lisa, he said, standing up. Fine, I said. But after that, you'd better come up with a plan, because I'm not hiding out in some crappy motel for the rest of my life. Dan nodded and stepped outside to make the call, leaving me alone with my thoughts. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in years. Fear. Fear of what was coming, fear of what my parents might do if they found out I was involved, and fear of what I might have to do to protect myself. Dan's call took longer than I expected, and every second he was gone felt like it stretched forever. I stayed in the room, pacing back and forth, my nerves shot. My hands were shaking, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about everything he'd told me. My parents, my own parents, had been running some criminal operation for years, and I had been completely in the dark. When Dan finally walked back in, he looked pale, like he'd seen a ghost. He shut the door behind him and locked it before sitting down heavily on the edge of the bed. What did she say? I asked. She's scared out of her mind, Dan said. She thinks they're onto her, and she doesn't know how long she has before someone makes a move. She told me she's already handed over most of the evidence to the feds, but she kept a few key pieces for insurance, stuff that ties specific people to the operation. Why would she do that? I asked, confused. Wouldn't it make more sense to just give them everything? Dan shook his head. She doesn't trust them completely. She's worried they'll make a deal with Mom and Dad to go after bigger targets, and she'll be left out to dry. So she's holding on to the most incriminating stuff in case she needs leverage. What kind of stuff are we talking about? Names, bank accounts, transaction records. The kind of evidence that could take down not just Mom and Dad, but everyone they've been working with. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. And where is it now? Dan hesitated. She didn't say, but she hinted that it's somewhere safe, somewhere they can't find it. That's not good enough, I said. If they know she has it, they'll come after her, and if they can't get to her, they'll come after us. We need to know where it is. Dan nodded. I told her we need to meet in person. She agreed, but she's being cautious. She wants us to meet her tomorrow morning at a public place, somewhere crowded. Do you trust her? I asked. Dan frowned. I don't know. She's desperate, and desperate people do stupid things. But right now, she's the only one who knows exactly what we're dealing with. I didn't like it, but I didn't see any other options. If Lisa had the kind of evidence Dan was talking about, then she was sitting on a powder keg, and we were too close to it for comfort. The rest of the night was tense and uncomfortable. Dan insisted on keeping the lights off in the room and barely spoke, his eyes constantly darting to the windows and the door. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of all the worst-case scenarios. Men in black suits kicking down the door, Mom and Dad's faces twisted with anger, Lisa lying in a pool of blood because she trusted the wrong person. By the time the sun came up, I was a wreck. Dan and I left the motel early, driving in silence to the coffee shop where Lisa had agreed to meet us. It was a small, busy place in the middle of a strip mall, with plenty of people coming and going. We parked a few blocks away and walked the rest of the way, Dan constantly scanning the street like he expected someone to jump out at us. When we got to the coffee shop, Lisa was already there, sitting at a table in the corner with a laptop and a large coffee in front of her. She looked thinner than I remembered, her face drawn and tired, but her eyes were sharp, darting around the room like she was cataloging every person in it. When she saw us, she waved us over, but her expression didn't soften. "Sit down," she said as we approached. We sat, and for a moment, none of us spoke. Finally, Lisa broke the silence. "I'm guessing Dan filled you in," she said, looking at me. "More or less," I said, "but I want to hear it from you. What exactly are we dealing with?" Lisa took a deep breath. "Your parents are involved in one of the biggest money laundering operations I've ever seen. We're talking millions of dollars, moving through dozens of shell companies and offshore accounts. When I first started working for them, I thought it was legitimate. But the deeper I got, the more I realized something was off. And you didn't say anything? I asked, unable to hide the bitterness in my voice. I didn't know who to trust, Lisa said, her voice defensive. Your parents have connections everywhere. Banks, law enforcement, politicians. If I'd gone to the wrong person, I could have ended up dead. So what changed? Dan asked. I got out, Lisa said simply. After the divorce, I started digging through everything I had. It took years, but I finally pieced together enough to see the whole picture. That's when I decided to go to the feds. And now they know, I said. Lisa nodded. They know, but they don't have enough to move in yet. That's why they're still watching your parents, trying to gather more evidence. But the problem is, your parents know something's up. They've been making moves, shutting down accounts, cutting ties with people, trying to cover their tracks. And if they figure out I'm the one who talked, they'll come after you, I finished. Lisa didn't respond, but the look on her face said it all. Do you still have the evidence? Dan asked. Yes, Lisa said. The important stuff, anyway. It's hidden somewhere safe. Where? I asked. Lisa hesitated. I can't tell you that. Not yet. Lisa, this isn't a game, Dan said, his voice rising. If they find out you're holding on to something, they'll kill you. Hell, they might come after us just to send a message. We need to know where it is. I'll tell you when the time is right, Lisa said firmly. But right now, the less you know, the safer you are. I wanted to argue, but before I could say anything, Dan's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, and his face went pale. What is it? I asked. They know we're here, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. How? I don't know, Dan said, shoving his phone into his pocket. But we need to leave. Now. Lisa's eyes widened, and she grabbed her laptop, stuffing it into her bag. The three of us stood up and headed for the door. But before we could reach it, a man in a suit stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. Go out the back, Dan whispered. We turned and made our way toward the rear exit, trying not to draw attention to ourselves. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. When we reached the back door, Dan pushed it open, and we stepped into the alley behind the coffee shop. What now? I asked, my voice shaking. Keep moving, Dan said. We'll figure it out as we go. We started walking, trying to put as much distance between us and the coffee shop as possible. I didn't know where we were going or what we were going to do next, but one thing was clear. We were in way over our heads, and there was no turning back. The alley stretched on for what felt like miles, twisting and turning between buildings that all looked the same. We walked quickly, but not so fast that it would draw attention if anyone was watching. Every sound, distant footsteps, a car backfiring, even a bird squawking, set my nerves on edge. Dan led the way, with Lisa close behind him. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting the man from the coffee shop to appear at any moment. When we finally emerged onto a quiet street a few blocks away, Lisa grabbed Dan's arm. We can't just keep walking around aimlessly. We need to figure out where to go. Dan pulled out his phone, frowning as he stared at the screen. I've got a place in mind, but we need to get off the streets first. What place? I asked. It's an old apartment I used to crash at. Nobody knows about it, Dan said. We can lay low there until we figure out our next move. Lisa looked skeptical. How far is it? About 10 minutes if we take the back streets, Dan replied. We just need to stay out of sight. Lisa hesitated, but finally nodded. Fine, but if we get spotted, we're screwed. Dan didn't respond. He started walking again, and we followed him, sticking to the shadows as much as possible. I kept thinking about the man in the coffee shop, wondering if he was working for our parents or one of their so-called clients. The fact that he'd found us so quickly made my stomach churn. When we reached the apartment building, I wasn't impressed. It was old and run down, with peeling paint and broken windows. Dan led us to a side entrance, pulling out a key he'd had hidden in his jacket. This place looks like it's about to fall apart, Lisa muttered. It's not supposed to be luxury, Dan said. It's supposed to be safe. He unlocked the door, and we stepped inside. The hallway was dimly lit, with a musty smell that reminded me of the motel. Dan led us up a narrow staircase to a door on the third floor. He unlocked it and pushed it open, revealing a small, sparsely furnished apartment. The living room had a couch with a tear in the fabric, a coffee table covered in old magazines, and a TV that looked like it hadn't been turned on in years. The kitchen was barely big enough for one person to stand in, and there was only one bedroom. "It's not much, but it's better than nothing," Dan said, tossing his bag onto the couch. Lisa sighed and set her bag on the floor. "We can't stay here long. If they found us at the coffee shop, they'll figure out where we went eventually." "I know," Dan said, "but we need to regroup and come up with a plan before we make any more moves." Lisa sat down on the couch, rubbing her temples. "We're running out of time. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this gets." "We'll figure it out," Dan said, though he didn't sound convinced. I stayed near the door, feeling like an outsider in my own nightmare. What exactly are we waiting for? We can't just sit here and hope they don't find us. "I'm waiting for a call," Dan said, glancing at his phone. "From who?" I asked. "Someone who might be able to help," Dan said. Before I could press him for more details, his phone buzzed. He answered it quickly, stepping into the other room and closing the door behind him. Lisa watched him go, then turned to me. "I don't like this," she said. "Neither do I admitted. "But what choice do we have?" Lisa leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. "You think they'll really come after us? Or is Dan just being paranoid?" "I don't know," I said. "But after everything he's told me, I'm not willing to take any chances." We sat in silence for a while, the tension in the room so thick it was almost suffocating. When Dan finally came back, he looked more stressed than ever. "What did they say?" Lisa asked. "They're going to meet us," Dan said. "But we have to move fast. They won't wait long." "Who's they?" I asked, my patience wearing thin. "Someone I used to work with," Dan said. "They know how to stay off the radar. If anyone can help us, it's them." Lisa frowned. "And you trust them?" "I don't have a choice," Dan said. "They've helped me before, and they're the only ones who know how to deal with this kind of situation." "Where are we meeting them?" I asked. Dan hesitated. "It's not close. We'll have to drive through the night to get there." Lisa groaned. "This just keeps getting better." "It's the only way," Dan said. "If we stay here, we're sitting ducks." Reluctantly, we gathered our things and headed back to the car. Dan drove, his eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror, while Lisa and I sat in tense silence. The drive was long and uncomfortable, with Dan refusing to say where we were going or who we were meeting. When we finally arrived, it was nearly dawn. Dan pulled into the parking lot of an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of a small, desolate town. "This is it?" Lisa asked, her voice dripping with disbelief. Dan ignored her and got out of the car. "Stay here," he said. "I'll be back soon." Lisa and I exchanged a glance but didn't argue. We watched as Dan disappeared into the warehouse, the door slamming shut behind him. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an hour. I kept my eyes on the warehouse, half expecting Dan to come running out with someone chasing him. When the door finally opened again, my heart leapt. But it wasn't just Dan who stepped out. He was with a man I didn't recognize, tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a leather jacket. Dan motioned for us to get out of the car, and Lisa and I reluctantly obeyed. "This is him," Dan said, gesturing to the man. "He's going to help us." The man looked us over, his expression unreadable. "You'd better hope I can," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "because from what I've heard, you're in a lot more trouble than you think." The man Dan brought out of the warehouse was calm, but his presence was intimidating. He looked like someone who'd seen more than his share of dangerous situations and survived them all. He didn't waste time with introductions or pleasantries. "Follow me," he said, his tone making it clear that questions would not be tolerated. We followed him back into the warehouse, which was dimly lit and cluttered with old equipment. There was a table in the center of the room covered in maps, papers, and a laptop. He motioned for us to sit while he stood at the head of the table, looking over us like we were soldiers waiting for orders. "You're in a mess," he began, his voice steady but firm. I've dealt with situations like this before, but I need to know exactly what we're working with. If you hold anything back, it could get all of us killed. Dan nodded. We're not hiding anything. Lisa handed evidence over to the feds, but she kept some of the most sensitive stuff. We think our parents, or the people they've been working with, found out, and now they're coming after her. And maybe us. The man turned his attention to Lisa. What kind of evidence are we talking about? Names, accounts, transaction records, Lisa said. Everything they used to run the operation. I didn't give it all to the feds because I don't trust them to keep me safe if things go sideways. Where is it? He asked. Lisa hesitated, then said, It's encrypted on a drive. The drive is in a locker at a storage facility in the city. Only I know the code to access it. The man didn't look surprised, but his expression grew darker. If they know you've got that drive, they'll do whatever it takes to get to it, and to you. You should have handed it over and disappeared. Lisa didn't respond, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. The man turned to Dan. What about you? Do they know you've been involved? I don't think so, Dan said. But if they find out, I'm just as much of a target as she is. And so is my sibling. The man looked at me for the first time, his gaze sharp. You're the wild card. They probably haven't connected you to this yet, but if they do, you're going to wish you weren't here. I didn't ask to be here, I said. Dan dragged me into this. And now you're stuck in it, the man said bluntly. You need to decide if you're willing to see this through. If you're not, you need to walk away now. I wanted to leave. Every instinct I had told me to get out while I still could. But the thought of leaving Dan and Lisa to handle this on their own felt wrong. They were family, even if our parents had torn us apart. I'm staying, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. The man nodded, then looked back at Lisa. We need to get that drive before they do. Once we have it, I'll make sure it gets to the right people. And what happens to us? Lisa asked. I'll do what I can to keep you safe, the man said. But once this is over, you're going to need to disappear. New identities, new lives. If they think you're still out there, they'll keep coming. Lisa didn't look happy, but she nodded. What about our parents? I asked. The man's expression didn't change. If they're smart, they'll cut their losses and run. But if they try to fight this, they'll go down with everyone else. That's not your problem. It felt like a cold thing to say, but I couldn't argue with it. The plan was simple but risky. Lisa would lead us to the storage facility while the man, whose name we still didn't know, watched for any signs we were being followed. Once we had the drive, we'd regroup and figure out the next step. We left the warehouse just as the sun was coming up. The drive into the city was tense, with everyone on edge. Dan kept checking his mirrors, while Lisa stared straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap. When we reached the storage facility, Lisa parked the car and turned to the man. Are you sure this is safe? It's as safe as it's going to get, he said. Let's move. We got out of the car and followed Lisa into the facility. She led us down a row of lockers to one near the end. She pulled a key from her pocket and unlocked it, revealing a small metal box. Inside was the drive, a simple black device that looked completely ordinary. Is that it? Dan asked. Lisa nodded. The man took the drive and slipped it into his jacket. Let's go. We turned to leave, but before we could take more than a few steps, a black SUV pulled into the lot, blocking our path. The doors opened and 3 men stepped out, all of them armed. Get back inside, the man said, pulling a gun from his waistband. We retreated into the storage unit, the man covering the entrance. The sound of footsteps grew louder as the men approached. You've got nowhere to go, one of them called out. Hand over the drive, and we'll let you walk away. The man didn't respond. Instead, he motioned for us to stay low. The next few minutes were a blur. The men tried to force their way in, but the man guarding us didn't hesitate. He fired 3 shots, and one of the attackers went down. The others returned fire, but the man was ready, keeping them pinned down while we scrambled for cover. Stay here, he barked. He stepped out of the storage unit, and we heard more gunfire. Then everything went quiet. When he came back, his jacket was torn, and there was blood on his arm, but he was alive. Let's move, he said. We followed him back to the car, our hearts pounding. As we drove away, Lisa turned to him. What now? Now we finished this, he said. The drive was delivered to his contacts, and within days, everything started to unravel. Our parents were arrested, along with several of their associates. The operation they'd been running for years was exposed, and the fallout was massive. As for us, the man kept his word. He helped us disappear, giving us the chance to start over. It wasn't the life I'd imagined for myself, but it was better than looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life. Dan, Lisa, and I went our separate ways, each of us trying to make sense of what had happened. We stayed in touch, but it wasn't the same. Too much had been broken, and some things couldn't be fixed. In the end, all I could do was move forward, leaving the past and my parents behind.